Great. Well, thank you to our distinguished panel for coming to see us today. I'll let you introduce yourselves, but this is a sort of anorak session, and you can see I'm totally overexcited about it. What we're really looking at is how the House of Commons administration, not the administration committee, but collectively the administration can better promote through its various media avenues, communication avenues, what this Parliament does, what the House of Commons does, and why we are still a body, a chamber, a Parliament admired around the world for our practices and procedures, because I don't feel that the essence of that is captured and communicated in the way that it should be, and I think that view is shared by the committee. So I'm going to start with our three panellists. Just introduce yourselves very briefly, and then we'll go straight into questioning. Start with you, Mark.
Mark Darcy, Parliamentary Correspondent, BBC News for a disturbingly long time.
Philip Norton, Lord Norton of Louth, Professor of Government at the University of Hull.
And I'm Meg Russell, Professor of British and Comparative Politics and Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm just going to throw in a very, very general question to get the conversation going. And I'm going to start with Mark and answer it in the way that you want. What does the House of Commons, UK Parliament, do really well, and how could we better communicate that, in your view? It's a tough one.
It's a tough one, partly because I think
it's so big.
One tends to think of the things that the House of Commons perhaps doesn't do as well as it might. I think that the House of Commons is very good at some things these days. It's much better now than it used to be at reaching out and picking up subjects that the public are interested in, partly through the petitions mechanism, partly through the backbench business committee mechanism, and having really good debates that kind of prod the government towards doing things. It's less good at actually making the government do things because it is, of course, controlled by a government majority, or under almost all circumstances, and the brief chaotic interludes when that hasn't been the case haven't necessarily been the best advertisement for the Commons there. So I would say it's become a lot better at addressing human issues, the kind of Thursday afternoon backbench debates that you often get about really difficult issues where people talk about relatives of theirs who've taken their own lives, or about their experience of disease or depression or psychological ailments of one sort or another, have been very important in perhaps shifting focuses. But if you're talking about the House of Commons as a genuine check on government, I'm not sure it always looks like a great check on government, to be honest.
Okay, let me just widen that question out slightly as we go down. So Mark said we don't have a great check on government. And yet, when I was chair of the Procedure Committee and I was visited by legislators from parts of the world, developing parliaments, established democracies, they were often impressed about the powers MPs had to hold the executive to account, be it that urgent questions, statements, so on and so forth, private members' bills, to initiate legislation. Lord Norton.
Well, the point I'd make is that there are some structures and procedures that you've got that work well. Mm-hmm. The problem that the Commons faces is that is not what interests people outside. So in terms of communication, if you're talking about your structures and processes, that doesn't relate to what people are interested in. Because if you look at your goals of this particular inquiry, there's a potential incompatibility between raising awareness of Parliament and calling attention to the mechanisms you've got for scrutiny and influence, because that doesn't engage people. So there's a potential incompatibility there. People are much more interested in issues, and they're much more interested in the individuals in the institutions than the institutions themselves. Now, we know from survey evidence that people aren't that distrustful of the constitutional framework we've got. They might not like bits of it, but it's the people who occupy it that they're really distrustful of. So I think that's a problem. So we've got a problem with electors. We've increasingly got a problem with the media in putting material out there, because social media now, the emphasis on the immediacy, sound bites, it's squeezing out what the mainstream media can do because they're having to cut back on resources. You're missing out now because the cutbacks on BBC Parliament. There's a problem as well with MPs themselves, because they're interested in themselves individually, not necessarily the institution of which they're a member. They'll promote themselves and their party above the interests of the institution. And there's a problem in communicating when there is a problem, because who speaks for Parliament? I mean, a few years back I gave the Michael Ryan Memorial Lecture, and that was the title of the lecture. Who speaks for Parliament? Parliament is two discrete institutions. Each is the sum of its parts. There is no one who can speak for the whole institution. And even within each house, there's a problem how quickly you can respond. Well, if you've got to agree a line to take, by the time you've agreed it, it's too late. So I think there needs to be a fundamental rethink, not so much about the structures and processes, but how you communicate them. How do you get people interested in what you're doing? And the way in is not through actually describing those structures and processes. It's finding another way, say, of emphasising the issues or indeed focusing on individuals. That's what interests people. The media will pick up on when individuals misbehave. What about when individuals achieve some success? What about promoting that? And that's what interests people. There's a human interest element to it. They're not interested in standing orders and how select committees go about their work. So you've got a Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee. That's not necessarily going to engage people, but some of the issues it addresses may do. Mm-hmm. And when you think about the correspondence you quite often get from constituents, it's on issues that come up, say, through private members' bills, because that's what really gets them excited. It's how you exploit that to show that Parliament's addressing issues that interest them, rather than Parliament pushing out information about the structures and the wonderful committees that it's got.
Meg.
That's really interesting, and I agree with all of that, really, and we may agree a dangerous amount on the panel, but I would say some other things. I mean, I think it's... there are some obvious answers to your question. What does the House of Commons do well, and how well does the administration do it at publicising it? I mean, it's a pretty uncontroversial thing to say that select committees are, seen as a high point of what the House of Commons does, and I think the administration does a lot of good work at communicating what select committees do. So that's a sort of good on both sides of the ledger. But I think when you get beyond some of those obvious things, going back to what Mark was saying about how impactful Parliament really is on government, my work, which includes quite detailed work on the legislative process, as well as on the House of Lords, which we're primarily not talking about today, but the legislative process in both chambers, suggests that actually Parliament is more influential than it's often given credit for. And I would point to two things which are both quite challenging for communication for the administration, one of which Philip has recently turned his attention to in his writing, which is that a lot of influence goes on behind the scenes. There are lots of places in Parliament where things are transcribed, where things are broadcast, but a lot of the real influence goes on in meetings between members and ministers, persuading people and so on, with the public record not entirely capturing that influence. And then the other thing, which is very subtle, is that some of the things that Parliament does on the public record are not decision-making activities, but they're enormously important for holding the government to account. So things like, if you talk to any member of the public, and if I talk to my students about what they know about what goes on in Parliament, they'll all say Prime Minister's question time, and then they'll all grumble about Prime Minister's question time. They don't know about departmental question times. And in departmental question times, and when ministers are presenting bills, and in backbench debates and opposition days, and in all sorts of stuff that goes on in the chamber and committees, the very fact that the government is being held to account in a public place and having to explain itself is enormously important. And my work talking, and you'll all be familiar with this, you talk to ministers or people who have been ministers, and they talk about the amount of work that they have to put into thinking things through before appearing in front of Parliament. Therefore, Parliament has a deterrent effect. We call this the power of exposure, the power of anticipated reactions. So Parliament, I think, is really important in these ways, but they're not very visible. They're difficult to communicate. And when you set that against the way that, I hate to say it, many MPs talk about Parliament, I mean, government and opposition tend to be united in saying that Parliament doesn't matter. The government wants to pretend that Parliament hasn't won things from it, The opposition wants to pretend or actually genuinely believes that it hasn't won anything from government. So you've got both sides of a natural political divide saying, oh, Parliament doesn't really matter very much. When actually I would argue that it does, and that actually, as Philip said, who speaks for Parliament? I think maybe beyond the administration, we need to think about how members communicate the importance of what Parliament does collectively, because of course this is by its nature a divided place into, it's not just government opposition, it's obviously different parties. But to what extent do members concentrate on celebrating the achievements of Parliament as a collective institution? I think the speakers of both houses do that quite a lot, but I think members could do it rather more.
Yeah. As I say to my children, this wonderful country didn't happen by accident. It's shaped by the laws that came out of Parliament over centuries. Right, Giles.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, what you were saying, Philip, was very, very interesting. We do put it all out there. Here we are in a public meeting. This will be available, will be online, but people, and I'm also on the DCMS committee, which is meeting tomorrow morning, and we're talking to ITV, and I'll bet you we get more people watching that. But it fascinates me because it's all available, and I feel that we should somehow flag it. The media, as you quite rightly say, are only interested when we're having a go at each other, and there's a bit of argy-bargy going on, because it's sexy and it's exciting and all of that. But actually, a lot of the times in the committee rooms, we agree with each other, and it's kind of boring, really, but it's really important. I think Parliament, Meg was just saying, Parliament is sort of, if you like, set upon by both sides of the House. But actually, Parliament does work, and we should make sure that people see that it works, and every time there's an imbalance and something goes wrong, Parliament brings it back, and it's an incredibly successful institution. And I think somehow we need to look at ways of highlighting what we in this committee are doing. And how would you think we could do that?
Can I just put that to Mark first? Because Mark,
yes, put it to Mark. Yes, sorry.
You've made, and I mean this to celebrate your work, you've made your career looking at the boring but important stuff, the engine room of Parliament, but you have, and you've done it really well, and you've made it interesting. Just can you start off by answering Giles's question, then we'll take it down the line.
Thank you.
I think, Mr. Watling, you're right that there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on, particularly in committees, and the committees are one of the more attractive phases of Parliament because it isn't the bear garden of some of the sort of full-on Commons confrontations, and a good committee has members from different sides working together, perhaps different people in the lead for different things, and it's a much more cooperative image, and it looks a lot more like what people experience outside, in the outside world when they're working together, than a lot of what goes on in the chamber. So to that extent, I think committees are give a more positive light. It may not be the excitement of a hammer and tongs battle, but when you're watching a committee addressing something that people really care about, interrogating the bankers after the financial crisis, interrogating the protagonists over the handling of COVID, all those kinds of things. It's something that people do watch and find absolutely fascinating. I'd suggest another area where people watch a lot, and I'm amazed that more members haven't cottoned onto this, is petitions committee debates, hashtag-driven social media campaigns leading to petitions, leading to debates in Westminster Hall. It's what we call in the trade news you can use. It's stuff that people are interested in being talked about by members of Parliament, and while it doesn't necessarily directly lead to stuff, it does doubtless influence the ministers who have to respond to the debates. So that's another sphere I could point to as being very useful indeed. What could you do to promote it more? That's the difficult bit, really, because news is not all happening in conveniently dribbled out pieces where everything happens at a measured pace. You can have a fantastically important select committee report that's just buried by other events. And that's just the luck of the draw when you go on with those things.
It's a good day to bury bad news, yes.
Yeah. But I think, incidentally, I should say that I think that the select committees are pretty well served by the press operation around them, which tells people what's happening, which promotes their output, which gets the chair or the lead member on a particular subject onto the Today programme or whatever. They do a pretty good job at that. And I think I don't really have a sort of silver bullet suggestion as to how you can get much more attention than you get already. Maybe make the language a bit more accessible sometimes. Committee reports are written in a very formal way, but there's a reason for that as well. and often the language is a heavily compromised and negotiated turn of phrase. So I don't have a vast silver bullet about it, but I would say that those are the parts of Parliament's activities that people can watch without their teeth aching.
Okay. I'm going to go to Meg and then to you, Lord Norton. Meg.
Okay. I think this is it. Obviously, this whole inquiry, you're asking a huge question. Yeah. And it's very tempting when you ask about, how does Parliament communicate, to look at the kind of comms people, which obviously Mark is here talking about the comms people, and that's entirely appropriate, but they're only part of it. So you're not entirely dependent on the media to tell your story. You've got your press officers, but you've also got your website. You've got social media and so on, which is part of the direct comms side, obviously. And going back to things you're doing well, I think things like committee reports that have been mentioned, House of Commons library briefings and so on, which aren't primarily about comms. They initially, of course, existed behind the scenes for members only until everything went online, and now we've all got them, and they are probably not part of the comms strategy, but they're a fantastic resource that helps people understand what's going on in Parliament. You've got individual MPs communicating things as well. I would say one thing to throw in, because I think I don't have a very clear example of what you can do to duplicate this, although I do have one idea. But if you think about communications in the broadest sense, I am at one of the universities, as I think is Philip, which is part of the Parliamentary Universities programme, where we deliver a course on parliamentary studies for undergraduate students, which gives them 10 or 20 weeks or something of in-depth learning about the way that Parliament works, which enables them to get to understand some of the sort of more obscure things that you're talking about that are away from PMQs. That hundreds of students pass through that every year. Some of them will go to work in the media, some of them will go to work in the civil service, some of them will be working in the voluntary sector, some of them come and work in Parliament. I see that as a communication tool to help people to understand Parliament. That's a really strategic intervention, which isn't done by media officers, but is a really important thing that Parliament has done. And I think thinking about more things like that, not just what the media officers do, could be a really important part of this. And my answer to that, which we could come back to in terms of what next, might be to have more of a sort of induction programme for MPs and an encouraged outreach programme by MPs about how they can communicate what Parliament does more widely than in the universities.
That's fantastic. Lord Norton.
Just to pick up on that last point, I'd endorse entirely what Meg's just said. I think the education side of Parliament, what it does there is successful, and really need to build on that. It really reaches out to schools and so on. And we've got a Peers in Schools programme, very successful. Coming back to the question itself, I mean, your first point reinforcing what I was saying, because the reason the media will be there tomorrow is not because some intrinsic interest in the DCMS committee, it's because of the issue, it's because of personality. Yes. That's what drives it. So how do you use that to promote? So I think that's a key element. Now, you're quite right. Most of the work that the House does, its detail, I mean, if you think you've got problems, think about in the Lords, where most of our time is on the boring detail. We don't get any notice at all. So the way to think about it is not telling people what you're doing. Think of it from the perspective of when you're communicating, what's in it for them? Why should electors be interested? So I think what you need to focus on is not structures and processes, but what difference does it make? So you might make some changes. In aggregate, it could be quite significant. Yeah. That's what you need to be looking at. What difference does it make to people outside? So I think that's really what the starting point should be. How do what you do help the public? How does it impact upon them? So how do you frame the work that you do in that respect? So yes, you've got your communications team, but I'd also point out you've got you. This was my point about members. You are part of the solution. I mean, to some extent, there'd be the argument members are part of the problem, but because of just the demands made on your time and trying to cope with everything, but you're also part of the solution. You are the best people to be out there beating the drum for the work that is being undertaken. So I think there are a number of routes that one can pursue, but I think resources are important for the purpose of doing that. And there is the danger that I think even with increased resources, they're still very limited, and there's a danger of sort of stressing economy to the disbenefit of the House and promoting what it's doing.
Okay. Thank you, very good, thank you.
John and then Michael.
Thanks, Charles. I've thought for a long time that power's tended to drain away from here into Whitehall. I mean, that's not a part of political comment. That's happened under every government. So, for instance, after 97, you had the introduction. I'm talking about the Commons now, not the Lords. You had the introduction of programming. Before that, in 94, you had the Watling report, which introduced guillotining. Now, all that reduces the ability of the Commons when it comes to holding the executive to account. Do you think that's been a factor in what's happened over the past few decades? I mean, if you listen to David Davis, the Privy Councillor David Davis, he would tell you, well, he told me, that he thought things had been going downhill since roughly 1882. Because in 1882...
My grandmother was born.
Oh, no. In 1882, before that, the government had no control over the timetabling of the House of Commons. The backbenchers controlled it. I'm not advocating that we should go back to that, but you think that general drift, which has been going on for about 40 years, of power going from here over there, has that been a factor?
I think, and this is, of course, incidentally, I should emphasise a personal opinion, there is a bit of a weariness about when there's a lot of kerfuffle in Parliament and then nothing actually happens, because Parliament doesn't seem to be able to get a grip on things, particularly the Commons. So that changes when a government doesn't have a majority. So power shifted dramatically back to the floor of the House of Commons after the 2017 election, for example, for quite a long time. They didn't necessarily manage to establish a majority for anything else, but they certainly made the then government's life extremely difficult for a couple of years. So in circumstances where you have a very tightly balanced House of Commons, then there is genuine power in the chamber. But when there's a nice big comfortable government majority, to the extent where a government can shrug off rebellions on its own side, then governments pretty much get their way in the House of Commons, and then the House of Lords becomes the major check on what goes on in Parliament. And the House of Lords, as Lord Norton's been observing, is not a heavily scrutinised chamber a lot of the time. And when they make really quite substantial changes to legislation, and then the Commons bats them back with a flip of the wrist after a 45-minute debate, it strikes me that you're seeing the kind of power imbalance made flesh, really. There's only a part of Parliament that seems to be both willing and able to do things that a government doesn't want it to do, and it's quickly and swiftly overridden.
Could I provide a slightly different perspective? Because, don't put yourselves down. Yes, since the Balfour reforms of 1902, the Commons has been very limited, the government's in the driving seat, and there is the view that over the past 40 years the position's exacerbated. I tend to hear that quite a bit from colleagues in the Lords or ex-MPs. But in fact, there's also a counterbalancing aspect to it. Don't forget you've had the introduction of departmental select committees, public bill committees are improvement on standing committees. You've now got the petitions committee, which is linking more with people outside. MPs themselves are more independent in their behaviour than before over the past 30, 40 years. Significant increase in voting independence. You're better informed in terms of material coming in. You're better resourced compared with members before. So, and sometimes you've been able to engage in pre-legislative scrutiny, which has made a difference. There's a case for expanding that significantly, quite a significant case for post-legislative scrutiny. But there have been countervailing pressures which have actually strengthened the House. So I think a lot depends on members actually utilising the opportunities that you've got. And the other change, I suppose, which has been significant, is the willingness of the Speaker to grant urgent questions and call ministers in to face questioning. So it's not a one-sided direction of travel. So I think members could do a lot to exploit what they've already got. I'd like to see it built on and more changes made that would enable you to really scrutinise
And
government
so
more
the point is, and I'm just going to bring Megan, we're not passive observers to this. Parliament has powers, we utilise powers, and the public is probably not so well aware of those powers because clearly, as you've alluded to, Mark and others, they prefer naturally the sort of scandal and the excitement as opposed to the grind, the coal-face work day in and day out.
And don't forget you can achieve change yourself in terms of structures and processes. It's not just affecting government and decisions they take. Where did departmental select committees come from? It wasn't the government. It was a report from a procedure committee, pressure in the House itself. I mean, the Cabinet wasn't that well disposed, and Margaret Thatcher put in a memo against introducing them, but the Cabinet wasn't prepared to stand up to an assertive House. That's how you got departmental select
The Petitions Committee wasn't how the government envisaged it. The Petitions Committee was meant to be a joint enterprise between Number 10 and the House, and actually now the House entirely owned the Petitions Committee in every way. But again, sorry, Meg, I'm interrupting you because you're going to answer John's question as well, then we're going to go to Michael.
Well, I was going to say some very similar things to Philip, so I won't repeat them except maybe throw in the words Backbench Business Committee onto the list, which you made that you hadn't mentioned. I think it's a more complicated picture, and it's a bit more complicated perhaps than Mark points out as well, because of course the power ebbs and flows between government and parliament, and it is related to the size of the majority. But one of the things I think that we saw with the very large Blair majorities from 1997 through to 2005 was initially it looked like government was all powerful, and then actually Parliament started putting more and more checks in place, and there was a kind of counter reaction to that, which saw some of the changes that we've discussed. Now, in more recent years, we've seen tighter majorities, particularly under the minority government of Theresa May, where the government becomes very, very resistant to Parliament getting in its way because it's got a difficult life enough already, thank you very much, without Parliament slowing things down. So you begin to see things like the overuse of delegated legislation and so on. And I think in this Parliament, actually, even with a large majority, some of those things are hanging over now. We're seeing too much rushing through of primary legislation, for example, as sort of emergency measures, when they really don't have to be rushed through in that way. There should be more proper scrutiny. So it goes in both directions. There are reactions and counter-reactions. But touching on something that Charles said, which was mentioned by other speakers before, which I didn't comment on, the sort of ding-dong element of Parliament and how that's what the media like to report, and that's what the public sees very often. Of course, it's not what the public likes. There's quite a lot of what goes on in Parliament that doesn't get reported, which is the sort of thing that the public like, which is people constructively working across party differences on issues of importance and so on. And I think it's a real shame that the public don't see more of that, because Parliament is about that an awful lot of the time, as you all know. So how can we communicate that better, I think, would be an interesting question.
How Parliament can communicate.
The select committees do it quite well. You know, the culture of the select committees, which is cross-party, is communicated quite well, but the select committees are not the only cross-party place in Parliament, and we don't hear about the rest of it.
John, are you...
No, I'm okay, thanks.
Okay. By the way, I was on a Lords Commons pre-legislative scrutiny committee on the Mental Health Act, and it was simply fantastic. It was amazing. We met for dozens, scores of hours, but it was worthwhile. Michael.
Well, I mean, Lord Norton said that, of course, people aren't interested in the procedure, they're not interested. They are interested in the ding-dong. And so my first question, actually, is the biggest ding-dong of all, of course, is Prime Minister's questions. I remember years ago in a private visit to Washington, getting out of a thunderstorm and going into Congress and getting recognised by a congressman, despite the fact that I was just wearing a wet sweatshirt and a pair of shorts, because he'd seen me on C-SPAN on PMQs. It must have been the hair, I guess. But the point is, do you think bad is driving out good, in the sense that PMQs does more harm than good? Not because it tells a bad story, but because people are so interested in seeing the ding-dong, they're not really interested in anything else.
Mark.
Oh, Lord. I always think that Prime Minister's questions is kind of a hermetically sealed rumpus room in Parliament where people can run a bit amok for a little while and perhaps doesn't creep too much into the rest of business. Occasionally, when there's something really contentious, maybe you get a bit of PMQs-like behaviour. My main comment about Prime Minister's questions is, and I don't think, when it degenerates into a sort of fatuous exchange of not very good pre-scripted gags, what's the point? Sometimes you can feel your soul leaving your body when you're in the gallery, and it's just awful. And you're just hoping that someone downstream, outside the main exchanges, will finally say something interesting to liven it up a bit. And because it's become a kind of piece of performative theatre now, and once it does that and stops having a direct parliamentary function, then I don't think it works very well. And it doesn't do Parliament any particular credit. When you get the occasions when there are serious questions to be asked about something serious and it's treated seriously by all the protagonists, it's a completely different atmosphere. But when it's just one of these pieces of performance art, I'm not sure anybody's very impressed anymore.
Lord Norton?
Well, I was going to say, it's televisual, that's why it gets the attention it does. And if it wasn't covered, the cameras wouldn't be switching to something else to cover what's going on. So I think it's a choice between PMQs or no PMQs rather than PMQs or something else. So people don't like it, but they watch it in enormous numbers. So at least it raises awareness of the House of Commons, and they do see MPs at work, and MPs do exploit it. Many years ago, a former student of mine did his doctoral work on the difference that the introduction of cameras into the House of Commons made in 1989. And the biggest difference to Prime Minister's question time was the use of the word constituency.
There we go. Professor Russell.
There's some interesting work on PMQs. I mean, in many ways it's problematic, but it's not as simple as it looks. There is some interesting academic work showing that PMQs does help to engage people, as Philip has said, with Parliament, for good or ill. And then there's also work which I'm sure you're sort of again familiar with this dynamic, that it actually has quite an important galvanising effect inside government in terms of people being ready for the things that might come up. There are these stories about how Margaret Thatcher used it as a way of controlling her departments by getting her briefings in advance and knowing what was going on in every department in Whitehall with the excuse of being briefed for PMQ. So it's a much more complicated institution than many people give it credit for. But let me come back to a point that I made before, which is what are we doing to publicise departmental questions? Because actually departmental questions are a much more sort of ostensibly sensible exchange of, a clearer form of accountability on details of policy. If you go to the homepage of Parliament, which I've done a bit of in preparation for this hearing, there's nothing about departmental questions on the homepage of Parliament. There's nothing in the news feed about what departmental questions are coming up. They're almost impossible to find. So I think there are things that you could do to point to be fair, you're not really publicising PMQs either, and perhaps that's less surprising. But there are some different forms of accountability going on in question time, which maybe the public could be pointed towards more actively, I think, and they would realise that PMQs is just one small part and not representative of the whole.
In fact, you lead me on to the question I was going to ask directly at Mark, Meg, because you were talking about how we can push out, because as academics, you two are sort of pulling in, and you know what questions to ask. And Mark does too, because he's been here a long time. But I wonder whether the administration of this place does enough to actually give you information that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise be able to glean, which would enable you to do more wide area of programming. And also, I'm going to ask you after this, by the way, what is happening to the BBC coverage of Parliament? But that's the second question. If the chair
ask that question now. Let's put all those questions
all right,
into.
Then I will do just that. I mean, I'm slightly worried about where the Parliament channel's going, as was alluded to earlier on. There's less budget available. Talk about the BBC going on to streaming only. The Parliament channel mainly concentrates on what's happening in the chamber, doesn't actually show what's going on in Westminster Hall, all those interesting debates you mentioned earlier, or indeed in committee. You try, but you've only got one channel on the Parliament channel. So with a goist coverage of Parliament.
Well, Let's start by naming a couple of things that aren't happening. There was a brief kerfuffle around the idea that Parliament, the BBC Parliament, was going to cover fewer select committees. That is simply not the case. The Director General has written a letter, you can find it on the liaison committees page, flatly denying that there's any such plan, or indeed the BBC Parliament is going to be converted into a streaming service or anything like that. So, those things are not happening. And it's pretty much as simple as that. And BBC Parliament has always operated on it with very, very few exceptions when great events are happening, perhaps in the liaison committee or something, that it is almost always the Chamber of the Commons if the Chamber of the Commons is in session, that is what BBC Parliament will be pointing its cameras at. And if there are select committee meetings, they are put in the sort of space around that. They show the House of Lords as soon as the Commons has stopped, and then they put the select committees in the sort of remaining bits of
Mark,
space.
as someone who covers Parliament, someone who's got deep insight, do you think that policy is the best?
Well, I think that it's very hard to construct an alternative policy that doesn't get you into more trouble. And having a simple, consistent set of rules. And one of the things is that there are plenty of other places. If there is a big select committee hearing on, it may run on the news channel. But there are going to be people who want to see what's going on in the Chamber of the Commons. And so part of the point of BBC Parliament is simply so that people can watch the Chamber of the Commons. Whether you've got a Prime Minister falling or it's the committee stage of the Government of Wales bill, you're going to be the BBC cameras will be pointing at whatever's going on in that chamber. So you've got that service that is being operated as a basic democratic service that people can see that. That you could start making editorial choices and say, oh, we're not going to show this, we're going to show that. And as my former boss at BBC Parliament used to say, that way madness lies. You'd never hear the end of it. As soon as you took something off in favour of something else, there would be eruptions and letters flying in all directions. So I can't speak in great detail to BBC Parliament because I don't actually work for it. I mean, it's in the same sort of operation as I am, but I'm not there. But what I do know about it is that it works on a very simple principle, that they point their cameras at what you MPs are saying while you're saying it. And I think most of you would probably think that was a good idea.
Back to my original question, is there more Parliament could do to help you?
Actually,
and that is addressed to all three of you, I guess.
Parliament is doing an awful lot more now to help journalists both know what's going on and understand it. The clerks do a weekly procedural briefing on a Monday. There are emails that go out saying what's coming up in the select committees, what's coming up in the chamber. The petitions committee will send you an email saying this is what's going on in next week's debate. The Backbench Business Committee will do the same. So there are great efforts to explain to us what is going on all the time. And frankly, if you've got a question, you can usually find a clerk who will explain some arcane point of procedure in terms so simple that even I can understand it. So that there are those things there which weren't there when I started in anything like the same extent. I mean, Robert Rogers, as he then was, started doing briefings on big procedural issues when I think he was clerk assistant or something back in the Cretaceous period. And they were incredibly helpful. And I think things began to grow a little bit from there. But there's a limit to how much the clerks and Parliament can tell journalists without starting to stray into politics. And so, you will start asking the Labour whips, for example, about what the cunning plans behind whatever Labour's motion on the opposition day is going to be. You will start asking people behind amendments what they're trying to achieve, because you have to go direct to those people to do it. There's a limit to how much the institution can do without getting bogged down in the politics of what's being done.
Could I deal with the BBC Parliament point and then come on to the wider, what the House could do through its own resources? Because I understand it now, BBC Parliament doesn't generate its own content and doesn't cover events in the way that it used to. And from an educational point of view, I thought those were extremely valuable, very worthwhile. It actually generated quite good viewing figures, and it was generating quite good viewing figures on very limited resources. I mean, the BBC Parliament used to be run basically by one man and his dog, and now they've shot the dog. So there's a lot more that could be done there. On your point about what Parliament could be doing, one thing one might want to focus on is the Parliament website. There's lots of material there, invaluable, but finding it, getting down to it's another matter, because it's driven from a Parliament perspective, which is structures and processes. It's not driven by thinking about what's it matter to people outside? What drives them? Which is the issues that are coming up. So rather than going on the Parliament website and seeing immediately, these are the issues Parliament's discussing this week, these are what interests you, committees, bills, Hansard, for people like us, we know how to use it because we've used it for ages. But for anybody out there just logging on to Parliament, where do they find out about the issue that really affects them? What's key to their interests? Well, by the time they've actually started to find out, they've lost the will to live. So you really need to think about what do you highlight there and sort of, if you like, ping each week about what's affecting electors, what matters to them, what are the issues that Parliament's actually discussing that will engage their interest. So as I say, start from the perspective of thinking what's in it for the members of the public, not look at it from a parliamentary perspective, which is very much driven by structures and processes.
Meg Russell, then I'm going to move on, Michael.
I was going to say something about the website as well. I mean, I think the website has some fantastically good stuff on it, and it is a huge undertaking to design a website for a place as complicated as Parliament. So, credit to those who work on it. I don't want to undermine, what they're doing, but I do agree with some of what Philip is saying. I mean, I said I looked at the website in preparation for this, and I thought, what would people be likely to look for? If you go to I use the website all the time, obviously as a specialist. It's not always easy to find what you want. I thought if I go to the homepage of Parliament and I want to know what government bills are in front of the Commons now, I literally don't know how to find that as a specialist, because there's a list of all bills, but they don't distinguish between which things are government bills and which things are private members' bills. And you can just about filter for what bills are in front of the Commons now, but it's an enormous list of 200 and something bills, most of which are private members' bills that haven't got a hope of anything happening. So which government bills are at what stage at the moment would be a sort of obvious thing that you might want to know from the Parliamentary website. And what private members' bills are there at what stage? Which ones have got the best chance, and where can I click to send people views about what I think, and who's sitting on the Public Bill Committee for that? Those kind of things. I think there is more that could be done. I actually think in some respects, when it comes to legislation, the House of Lords communications people are doing a rather better job than the House of Commons communications people. They seem to put a lot more focus on the legislative process. Yeah. So it might be useful to get those teams talking to each other, or have the Lords people in here. But I would come back to what I said before, just to re-emphasise, you can get stuck on focusing on the comms, but I think an awful lot of this isn't just about the comms people and what the comms people are doing, because the question of how you communicate what Parliament is doing is much bigger than that. Let me read you some words, which you'll recognise. This is a dead Parliament. It has no moral right to sit. That was a former Attorney General. If Parliament was a school, Ofsted would be shutting it down. That was the last Prime Minister but one in his Conservative Party conference speech in 2019. And we have been paralysed by a broken Parliament. That was the Conservative manifesto. Now, I'm not trying to make a party political point. I think it would be a bit hard in this instance to find voices on the other side. But those voices are very well heard. And if people are getting that message about Parliament from its most important members, it's quite hard for the comms people.
I don't want to make a party political point, and pleased for my Labour colleagues, but the Leader of Opposition, who I have huge regard for, went to Davos and said, you get stuff done here and you don't get stuff done in Parliament.
Yeah.
And
okay, good
that
example.
Really, I don't mean that, but that really was an upsetting thing to hear any parliamentarian say.
And I did say earlier that both the government side and the opposition side
and I'm not making a party political point. We have a duty not to Gerald Ratner did it to his company, didn't he?
Yeah, it is our central democratic institution, and we ought to be teaching people how to respect it, not teaching people to think it's broken, because it's not broken, actually.
Wow. Okay. Right. I'm going to bring Pauline in. Does anybody else?
It's all right, because I know
Pauline.
we're out of time.
Okay. Have I missed anything? That was really good. That exceeded all my wildest expectations. So I've got just a couple of ideas I want to put to you. So I have children. I have teenage children who go do their A-levels now at university, and they're very visual. They watch these lectures online, and I think they're called TED Talks. Is that right? I think for youngsters and for anybody accessing our procedures, it'd be quite nice to have a video, I don't think it exists, of what is an urgent question, and somebody engaging and enthusiastically describing what an urgent question is. To go to Meg's point, what are departmental questions? And once you've found out what departmental questions are, there's a place on the House of Commons website where if you're interested in, say, business, whatever BASE is called now, I don't know what it's called, it changes on a monthly basis, and that doesn't help. You can go there and scroll through question times, debates on the floor of the House responded to by business departmental ministers or their legislation, defence, so on and so forth. So my final question before we let you go, do you think there is a role for enthusiastic and engaging people to talk through what an urgent question is, what a select committee is, what business questions are, what a petitions debate is? Is that something we should be doing?
You're looking at me.
I'm looking at all of you. I haven't got my glasses on.
I think that possibly there is more scope for that, but I think actually there is a lot of good material of this kind already on the Parliamentary website. You know, in the education area in particular, the stuff for schools. It's just hard to find, and you have, as I say, organising a website like that, it's not my specialism. You know, you can't put everything at the top level and make everything visible, but then it's very hard to ensure that you've got the right routes for people to find what they want. But you know, my parting shot, I've emphasised it lots of times, is I think you need a programme to get MPs actually communicating what's important about Parliament in a way that the speakers do. Because I think actually the authorities are doing quite a lot. You can find interviews with officials and with individual members and so on the website, but I think you could do with a programme to rebuild faith in Parliament and understanding of Parliament coming cross-party.
Would you submit some written evidence with some of your ideas, please?
Sure.
Excellent. Yeah. Lord Norton.
I agree very much with that, and the sort of very thing you were talking about, Giles, used to be available on BBC Parliament, because they used to have those sorts of programmes explaining what processes were, you know, how it worked and so on. And as Meg was saying, it is available through the Education Service here as well, which does fantastic work, and I agree with her, it's sort of resources that ought to be available for members to go out and utilise as well. It's a sort of thing that really ought to be on the front of the website, that you can immediately access that sort of thing. And the other thing you might want to pick up on, which Meg alluded to, is actually interviewing members. And she mentioned what the Lords is doing. The Lord Speaker is doing podcasts with members, talking about them, their experiences, and showing the range of activities. And of course, that engages people. They're interested in what individuals do, where they come from. So that human interest aspect. Far more you can engage people by doing that. And just drawing in members to do that, but just generally seeing members as a resource, providing them with the ability to go out and explain to electors just what's happening here, but in a way that is engaging, it's interesting, it's not, I'm going to talk to you about delegated legislation, which, I mean, to be honest, at the Commons end turns MPs off, never mind electors. So, you know, but actually bringing it into from the perspective, I say, what's in it for them? Why should they be interested? So think of it from the point of view of electors, and you start to craft the appropriate material to really engage so they actually understand what this institution is about, and fundamentally what the Commons can do for them and the difference that it makes to their lives.
I completely agree with Philip on this, that what you need is material that is kind of issue-led rather than process-led. There are, however, some questions that always seem to keep coming up. There's seldom a Prime Minister's questions goes by without them. Why doesn't the Speaker make him answer the question? Why doesn't the Speaker order that person out of the chamber? Stuff. So I think some explainers, maybe by Mr. Speaker in person, on what powers they have and what powers they don't have might be quite useful there. And just give people a taste of how the place actually works so that they can understand at least those points about it. No one's talking about getting into the weeds of standing orders in any great detail, but just understanding that the Speaker doesn't necessarily have the powers of a football referee, for example, might be quite useful.
Is there any final questions from the
I was just going to say one thing. In fact, the speaker did do just that and ordered somebody out of the chamber just last question time. And I was going to ask a question on the website, but you've covered it well, because I do think it is hard to navigate. It's full of brilliant things, but it's hard to navigate for the outside. But I would say, to leave on a kind of positive note, I would say we have got things like Parliament Week, where we do, lots of members do try and get out and about and explain their roles. But I think one little point is one good initiative that we've had in the last few years is the Parliamentary photography, which has found a way into explaining people's roles and being very people focused, and I think has been a brilliant thing in here in explaining how Parliament works.
Would I just add to that, because it's picked up on a point we didn't touch upon, because there is the material that's educational, it's very good, reaching out to schools, doing a lot there, it's reaching out wider to people, but a lot could be done through actually citizenship education in schools. It's under-resourced. You put in the proper resources, you're going to reach out to people, they're going to understand Parliament far better, and until we get there, it's just going to be taught by people who aren't qualified to teach citizenship. You need qualified citizenship teachers. You really need to put the resources in to ensure it's taught effectively. In the long run, that's how you'll raise awareness of what Parliament is doing. It's more pervasive. That is the route in, and that's what I'd really stress.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fantastic session. If any of you would like to supply the committee with further written correspondence, evidence that we can review and ruminate on, I think that's right, we'd be very happy to receive that. Thank you to the three of you, and have a good rest of the day and a successful week. Thank you.